He told his wife he was going to create the greatest rock album of all time. 6 months later, he was curled up in his bedroom, refusing to speak, convinced the voices in his head were real. Now, with Brian Wilson gone, the world is finally starting to understand just how much he gave and how much it cost. This is the story of a man who chased the perfect sound and vanished inside the music that almost saved him. Sunlight dances across California's coast, and the radio hums with a promise. In the early 1960s, America was smiling, and no one smiled wider than the Beach Boys. This band wasn't born in a boardroom or a record label. Instead, they began in a modest Hawthorne home in Southern California. In the early 1960s, Brian Wilson formed the group with his younger brothers Carl and Dennis, their cousin Mike Love, and a neighborhood friend, Al Jardine. Their harmonies rode the wave of post-war optimism, a polished portrait of youth, freedom, and endless summer. But behind those lush vocals and striped shirts was a mind that refused to settle. Brian Wilson wasn't just a songwriter, he was a sonic architect. While the rest of the band focused on performance and image, Brian began crafting the band's musical identity. He was barely out of his teens when he started composing hits that defined a generation. Surfin' Safari, Fun, 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 I Get Around. Each track was tighter, smarter, more layered. It was fun, but not shallow. Brian understood structure, and he bent it subtly towards sophistication, even as the lyrics stayed light. At first glance, the Beach Boys were a marketing dream. California kids selling the dream of endless beaches and girls in convertibles. But the rhythm that drove Brian was different. Raised in a home shaped by an alcoholic mother and an abusive father who also acted as their early manager, Brian's childhood was steeped in contradiction. Music became both his escape and his battleground. His father's harsh discipline left deep scars, yet also instilled in him a drive for perfection. By 1964, the Beach Boys had released 10 albums. Their sound was polished, commercial, and everywhere, but Brian was exhausted. During a tour in late 1964, he suffered a nervous breakdown on a flight. That moment, mid-air, suspended in fear and noise, marked a turning point. Brian made a decision. He would stop touring and focus entirely on composing. What followed was a creative explosion. Untethered from live performance, Brian dove into the studio, working with session musicians who would later become known as the Wrecking Crew. While his bandmates performed around the world, Brian stayed in Los Angeles, constructing music that began to stretch the limits of what pop could be. In these early years, Brian Wilson was not yet the tragic figure he would become. He was an innovator, a dreamer, and still, despite everything, a young man trying to make something beautiful in a world that often felt anything but. The sun still shone on the Beach Boys, but for Brian, the light was beginning to feel a little too bright. The needle dropped, and something shifted. It was late 1965 when Brian Wilson first listened to Rubber Soul, the latest release from the Beatles. He played it again and again. Each track revealed a depth he hadn't heard before, a cohesion of sound and story that broke the rules of pop music. Brian wasn't just impressed, he was provoked. That album ignited something. If the Beatles could evolve beyond love songs and teen anthems, so could he. Brian began to imagine a new kind of record, one that was not just a collection of singles, but a journey. He turned to lyricist Tony Asher, a writer from the world of advertising, to help shape his vision into words that felt older, sadder, more complicated. The goal wasn't to entertain, but to move. What emerged from this ambition was Pet Sounds, layered, lush, vulnerable. Brian directed every note like a film score, using orchestral instruments, sound effects, and harmonies that bent the rules of traditional pop. The sessions were intense. Brian obsessed over detail. He instructed musicians to play Coke bottles with spoons, dogs to bark on cue, theremins to wobble through choruses. But the cracks were starting to show. While Brian pushed the boundaries of sound, The rest of the Beach Boys weren't all convinced. Mike Love, in particular, questioned the album's direction. The songs were introspective, melancholic. There were no surfing anthems here, yet Brian pushed forward, certain he was creating something that would change the world. Pet Sounds was released in May of 1966. Critics in the United Kingdom hailed it as a masterpiece. In the United States, reactions were more muted, sales dipped, and some fans felt alienated. The Beach Boys, America's sweethearts of summer, now sounded reflective, even spiritual. But one fan in particular was floored, Paul McCartney. He later called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written. The mutual admiration between Brian and the Beatles became a quiet, powerful rivalry. They inspired each other, measured themselves against one another. But Brian, already more isolated, was beginning to take the competition personally. He had made Pet Sounds. The Beatles would soon respond with Revolver, and Brian wasn't going to let them outpace him. He envisioned an album that would outdo everything he had ever attempted. It would be strange, ecstatic, bold. It would be called Smile, and it would either make him immortal or destroy him. It began with Brilliance, and then it broke him. Smile was meant to be Brian Wilson's magnum opus, a kaleidoscopic concept album that fused Americana, psychedelia, and spiritual longing. In his mind, it would transcend pop. It would paint a soundscape of America's soul, part circus, part church, part hallucination. To help write the lyrics, Brian partnered with Van Dyke Parks, a poetic and experimental voice who embraced surreal imagery and fragmented narratives. Together, they dove into uncharted waters. The sessions were unlike anything in pop music at the time. Brian pushed his musicians to improvise, to play unconventional instruments, to fragment songs into modular pieces that he would later assemble like a collage. Tracks like Heroes and Villains and Surf's Up hinted at something monumental. The studio filled with strange sounds, but also with tension. Within the Beach Boys, resistance was growing. Mike Love reportedly clashed with Parks over the lyrics. Others doubted the direction of the music. It didn't sound like the Beach Boys. It didn't sound like anything. Meanwhile, Capitol Records, impatient and confused, demanded something more commercial. But Brian refused to compromise. He believed Smile would be bigger than Pet Sounds, bigger than the Beatles. What he didn't see coming was Strawberry Fields Forever. When Brian heard it on the radio, something in him broke. The Beatles had done it again, another leap forward, another flag planted in territory he thought he was mapping first. He reportedly told his assistant, they got there first, and his confidence crumbled. The competition, once inspiring, now felt unwinnable. The sessions for Smile spiraled. Brian's mental health deteriorated under the weight of expectation, creative pressure, and mounting drug use. He started hearing voices. Paranoia crept in. He would obsess over details, then abandon them. He lost faith in the project, in his band, and in himself. By mid-1967, Smile was shelved. What remained was a collection of fragments, bootlegs, and legends. Capitol released a diluted substitute called Smiley Smile, salvaging parts of the original sessions. But the masterpiece Brian had envisioned was gone, and with it, his sense of purpose. He retreated. From the studio, from leadership, from life, the man who once heard music in everything now struggled to hear silence. What do you think would have happened if Smile had been released in 1967 as planned? Would it have changed music history, or was the world not ready for Brian's vision? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. After the collapse of Smile, Brian Wilson didn't just disappear from music, he disappeared from himself. What followed was a slow-motion erasure of a genius from the world he helped shape. The late 1960s bled into the 70s, and Brian sank into a private oblivion. Diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder, he began hearing voices that weren't there. He stopped leaving the house, days passed in bed, His weight ballooned, his voice, once golden, grew ragged and hesitant. His presence in the Beach Boys became symbolic at best. On stage, he was often replaced. In the studio, his brilliance flickered, then dimmed. In desperation, his wife Marilyn and others turned to Eugene Landy, a psychologist with a reputation for taking on cases no one else would. Landy's methods were unconventional and, at first, effective. He implemented a strict regimen: diet, exercise, control. Brian began to show signs of improvement. He started writing again, functioning, but the price was steep and hidden. Landy didn't just treat Brian, he absorbed him. He isolated Brian from friends, family, even his band. Landy inserted himself into every aspect of Brian's life. He decided who Brian could see, where he could live, what deals he could sign. He became his business manager, his gatekeeper, even co-credited himself on creative projects. Landy's control tightened into domination. By the late 70s, Brian had lost more than his autonomy. His marriage collapsed. His relationship with the Beach Boys fractured further. Still, the public saw signs of hope. In 1988, Brian released a solo album. It was his first in decades, and while it received praise, insiders knew the truth. Landy's fingerprints were everywhere. The psychiatrist was no longer just a handler, he was a puppeteer. But change was coming. At a car dealership in the late 80s, Brian met Melinda Ledbetter. She was a saleswoman, and he was a confused, half-present version of himself. What began as a simple interaction would soon become a catalyst for liberation. Melinda saw what others had ignored or accepted. Brian wasn't recovering, he was being held. Melinda challenged the system. She pushed back against Landy's control, eventually enlisting the help of Brian's family and legal authorities. After years of coercion and legal struggle, a court order in 1991 barred Eugene Landy from any further contact with Brian Wilson. The fog began to lift. Freedom didn't arrive in a single moment. It came in inches, slow, uncertain, and almost invisible. After Eugene Landy was legally removed from his life in 1991, Brian Wilson stood at the edge of an unknown future. He was alive, but fragile. His voice was tentative, his confidence brittle, but he was no longer alone. Melinda Ledbetter became more than a partner. She was an anchor. She helped Brian reclaim what had been taken: his choices, his voice, his music. Together, they rebuilt a routine, sought proper medical care, and opened space for creation to return. There were relapses, doubts, long silences. But Brian began to write again, not as the boy genius of the 60s, but as a man weathered by loss and still willing to try. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, Brian re-emerged into public life. Slowly, then steadily. He returned to the stage, first nervously, then with growing strength. Fans saw something rare, not a polished act, but a survivor. When he sang, his voice cracked. When he spoke, he sometimes stumbled, but his music carried decades of meaning. Every note held history. Then, something astonishing happened. In 2004, nearly 4 decades after it had been abandoned, Brian Wilson released Smile. Fully re-recorded, fully realized. It wasn't a patchwork of old tapes, it was a rebirth. He stood on stage and performed it in full, not as a broken man haunted by failure, but as an artist finally in control of his own myth. Critics called it a triumph. Fans wept. The world finally heard the album that had lived in whispers and shadows for so long. It was beautiful, strange, and unmistakably Brian. Not a product of youth, but of endurance. In the years that followed, he recorded more albums, collaborated with new artists, and reunited with members of the Beach Boys for select tours. He received awards, standing ovations, and reverence from generations of musicians who had studied him like scripture. But more importantly, he lived. Brian Wilson didn't just survive fame, illness, and exploitation. He transformed his pain into music. He married Melinda. He raised children. He made peace with his past, even as some wounds remained. When he passed away in 2025, the tributes came from every corner of the world. Not just for the Beach Boys or Pet Sounds or Smile, but for the man behind them. The man who chased the impossible song and, against all odds, found it. This wasn't a story wrapped in perfection. It was messy, fractured, human, and maybe that's why his music still resonates. Because behind the harmonies, there was always a man trying to feel whole again. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. What does Brian Wilson's journey mean to you? Do you think their songs were a masterpiece? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this,